To my granddaughter Brianna, I leave the entire estate. Value $14 billion. The lawyer's voice was the only sound in the room. My parents turned purple. My brother slammed his fist on the table. Sign the waiver, he spat. Or you're on the street tonight. I didn't blink. No. By midnight, they had thrown my clothes onto the sidewalk. They thought I was broken. But they didn't know about the iron key in my pocket. When they arrived the next morning to evict me from the cliffside citadel, they brought a demolition crew. But when the gates opened, they didn't find a victim. They found me standing next to the state attorney general. And for the first time, my family knew fear. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. For 25 years, I lived my life in the margins. I am an antique book restorer. My days are spent in a quiet, dust-mote-filled workshop using tweezers and archival glue to repair damage that time and carelessness have wrought. It is work that requires infinite patience, a steady hand, and the ability to hold your breath while the world spins on without you. It was fitting, really. I spent my days fixing broken things because I couldn't fix the broken people I went home to. My family was loud, not just in volume but in spirit. My father, Jeffrey, was a failed CEO who wore his arrogance like a suit of armor, convinced the world owed him a fortune he hadn't earned. My mother, Patricia, treated life like a photo shoot, constantly adjusting the lighting to hide the cracks in her marriage and her character. And my brother, Nathan, was a crypto gambler who viewed every relationship as a transaction he could leverage. They were a hurricane of ego and noise, and I was the silence that followed them, picking up the debris. I realized later that this was the trap. It's what I call the trap of normalized cruelty. You see, when you grow up in a house where affection is transactional and mockery is the default language, you don't realize it's abuse. You think it's your job description. I believed that if I was just quiet enough, just helpful enough, just invisible enough, I could bind the spine of this family back together. I thought my endurance was a virtue. I didn't know it was just a slow form of suffocation. The only time I breathed was on Sundays. Every Sunday at 1 o'clock, I drove to the cliffside citadel. My family hated visiting Grandfather William. They called it paying the toll to stay in his will. They would sit in his parlor, checking their watches, talking about stock prices and country clubs, waiting for him to die, but I went to the library. William wasn't just a tech tycoon to me. He was the only other person in the world who understood the value of silence. We wouldn't talk about money. We talked about history. We talked about preservation. He would watch me work on a crumbling first edition, his eyes sharp and knowing. Brianna, he told me, once you have the hands of a surgeon and the soul of a warrior, don't let them convince you that your quietness is weakness. It is strategy. I didn't understand him then. I thought he was just being kind to the granddaughter who didn't fit in. I didn't see that he was training me. He wasn't just watching me restore books. He was watching me survive them. He saw the way my mother made comments about my dusty little hobby. He saw the way my father dismissed my opinions at dinner. He saw the way Nathan borrowed money I didn't have and never paid it back. William saw it all. And while I was busy trying to mend the fraying edges of my family, he was quietly, methodically building a fortress to protect me from them. He knew I wouldn't save myself until I had no other choice. So he waited. He let me play the role of the fixer until the day he died, knowing that his death would be the final brutal cut that severed my loyalty to them forever. He didn't leave me a fortune to spoil me. He left me a fortune to arm me. The call came on a Tuesday night. A massive heart attack. Quick. Painless. The doctor said William was gone before he hit the floor of his library. The news didn't bring tears immediately. It brought a strange cold static, as if the only light in a very dark room had just been extinguished. But my family, they didn't go numb. They went into production mode. The funeral was grotesque. It wasn't a memorial. It was a networking event. My father, Jeffrey, stood by the casket, shaking hands with board members, his eyes dry and darting around the room to see who was watching him grieve. He wasn't mourning a father. He was auditioning for the role of patriarch. My mother, Patricia, treated the service like a runway show, wearing a custom black veil and dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief whenever a photographer was nearby. And Nathan spent the entire service texting, looking bored, as if death were just an inconvenience to his schedule. Standing in the back alone, I realized I didn't want to be near their performance. I watched them perform their grief like a bad play, and I saw the truth William had warned me about. They didn't love him. They loved what he provided. They were vultures, circling a carcass before it was even cold. I left before the reception. I couldn't stomach the sight of them drinking expensive wine and toasting to a fortune they hadn't earned. The will reading happened 2 days later. The conference room at the law firm was cold and smelled of lemon polish and greed. Mr. Anthony sat at the head of the mahogany table. He was William's oldest friend and attorney, a man with eyes like flint. My family swept in, taking the best seats, radiating entitlement. Jeffrey leaned back, unbuttoning his suit jacket. "Let's get this over with, Anthony," he said. "We have a company to run." Mr. Anthony didn't smile. He opened a thick leather folder. He began to read. "To my son Jeffrey I leave nothing. To my daughter-in-law Patricia nothing. To my grandson Nathan nothing." The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum sucking the air out of their lungs. Then Mr. Anthony continued, "To my granddaughter Brianna, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all financial assets, real estate holdings, and the controlling interest in Carter Industries. Total estimated value $14 billion. For a second, nobody moved. Then the room exploded. My father shot out of his chair, his face turning a violent shade of purple. "This is insanity," he screamed. "He was senile. She manipulated him." My mother was clutching her pearls for real this time, gasping for air. Nathan slammed his fist onto the table, cracking the glass of water in front of him. 14 billion. To her, she fixes old books. She doesn't know the first thing about money." Mr. Anthony raised a hand. Silence. The will is ironclad. William underwent 3 separate competency evaluations. There is no recourse. Jeffrey stared at me. His eyes weren't fatherly. They were predatory. He took a breath, composing himself, smoothing his tie. He sat back down and slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a pre-drafted legal document. "Listen to me, Brianna," he said, his voice dropping to that patronizing tone he used when I was a child. "We all know this is a mistake. You can't handle this burden. You're quiet. You're fragile. So here is the deal. Sign this waiver. You transfer the estate to me. In exchange, we will set up a trust for you. $1 billion. An allowance for life. You can go back to your little books and never worry about a thing." I looked at the paper. $1 billion to go away, to disappear, to let them win. I looked at my father, then at my mother, who was nodding encouragingly, and finally at Nathan, who was sneering. They didn't see a daughter or a sister. They saw an obstacle. I didn't touch the paper. I looked Jeffrey in the eye. No. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. My father's face hardened into something unrecognizable. "No," he whispered. "No," I repeated. "I'm not signing." "Then you are done," he hissed. "If you walk out of here with that money, you are no longer my daughter. You are an enemy, and I will destroy you." I stood up. I walked to the door. I didn't look back. That was the moment the war began. I drove straight back to my apartment. I needed to pack. I needed to think. But when I put my key in the lock, it didn't turn. I jiggled it, thinking it was just stuck. Then I saw the notice taped to the door. "Property seized by management." My phone buzzed. A text from my landlord, a man who played golf with my father every Sunday. "Sorry, Brianna," Jeffrey called. He said there are some legal issues with the lease guarantee. I have to lock it down until it's sorted. They didn't just kick me out. They erased me. My clothes, my tools, my unfinished restoration projects, everything I owned was behind that door. I stood in the hallway, the fluorescent lights humming above me, and I realized this was their strategy. Shock and awe. Strip me of shelter, strip me of resources, and wait for me to crawl back to the safety of their control. They expected me to call them crying. They expected me to beg. I didn't call. I walked back to my car. I had my purse, my phone, and the clothes on my back. And in the glove compartment, I had the heavy iron key William had given me 6 months ago. For a rainy day, he had said. It wasn't raining. It was a hurricane. The car hummed beneath me, putting miles between the city and my past. I drove east toward the ocean, toward Newport. The cliffside citadel wasn't just a house. It was a fortress built on a promontory of black rock, accessible only by a long, narrow causeway. As my car rumbled over the stones, the ocean crashed against the cliffs below, sending spray into the air. The gates were massive, wrought iron beasts that looked like they hadn't opened in a century. I rolled down my window. There was a keypad, but before I could reach for it, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Identify." "Brianna," I said. William's granddaughter. The gates groaned. They swung inward, slow and heavy. I drove through the gravel, crunching under my tires. The mansion loomed ahead, dark stone against a gray sky, imposing and silent. It didn't look welcoming. It looked impenetrable. I parked in the courtyard. As I stepped out, the front door opened. A man stepped out. He was huge, built like a tank, wearing a dark suit that couldn't hide the military bearing underneath. This was Marcus, head of security, former Navy SEAL. William had told me stories about him, about his loyalty. "Miss Brianna," he said. His voice was deep gravelly. He didn't ask why I was there. He didn't ask where my luggage was. He just stepped aside and held the door. "We've been expecting you." I walked inside. The main hall was exactly as I remembered. It vaulted ceilings, stone floors, the smell of wood smoke and old paper. But it felt different now. It didn't feel like a museum I was visiting. It felt like air entering my lungs after holding my breath for 25 years. Staff members appeared from the shadows. Not many, just the core team. They nodded to me, silent and respectful. They didn't look at me with pity. They looked at me like I was the captain who had finally boarded the ship. I walked into the library. It was my favorite room walls, lined with thousands of books, the scent of leather and dust wrapping around me like a blanket. I sank into William's chair, and that was when the realization hit me. It wasn't grief, it was clarity. I looked around at the fortress William had built. I thought about the apartment I was locked out of, the family that had discarded me the moment I became inconvenient. And I realized the terrifying truth. If William hadn't done this, if he hadn't left me this house, this money, this protection, I would have ceased to exist. My family would have ground me down into dust. They would have married me off to some business partner or kept me as a silent servant, erasing every unique part of my soul until there was nothing left but a reflection of their needs. A world without William wasn't just a sadder world. It was a world where I didn't survive. He didn't just save my financial future. He saved my life. He saved me. Marcus appeared in the doorway. "We've locked down the perimeter," he said. "The causeway gate is reinforced. No one gets in unless you say so." I looked at him. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one fixing things. I was the one being protected. "Thank you, Marcus," I said. "Your father has called the main line 6 times, he added. "He's screaming." "Let him scream," I said. "He can't hear us from here." I closed my eyes. Outside, the ocean roared against the cliffs. Inside, it was quiet. I was homeless, disowned, and under siege. But as I sat in that chair, gripping the armrests, I felt something new rising in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was the cold, hard weight of power. I was safe. And tomorrow I would be dangerous. The silence didn't last. The next morning, the digital siege began. I went to buy coffee at the village market, and my card was declined. Insufficient funds. I tried another. Frozen by issuer. I checked my banking app. Locked. My phone lit up with a notification, not a text, but a legal alert. My father had filed an emergency petition for temporary guardianship, claiming I was suffering from acute grief-induced psychosis and was unfit to manage my own affairs. They weren't just trying to take the money. They were trying to take my mind. They wanted to legally erase my ability to say no. I didn't call them to scream. I didn't cry in the car. I drove back to the Citadel, walked into the library, and sat across from Mr. Anthony. "They've frozen my personal accounts," I said, sliding my phone across the mahogany desk. Mr. Anthony didn't look up from his files. "Expected. They are trying to starve you out. Standard siege tactic. But they forget one thing." He slid a black card across the desk. "You aren't spending your money anymore. You are spending the estate's money. And that account has no limit." We turned the library into a war room. Maps of the estate were spread out on the table next to legal briefs. Marcus stood by the window, monitoring the perimeter cameras. Mr. Anthony highlighted clauses in the trust documents. I wasn't restoring books anymore. I was learning the architecture of my own defense. "The guardianship filing is dirty," Mr. Anthony noted, his voice dry. "They are claiming you have a history of instability. They're using your quietness against you, calling it catatonic episodes." "Let them file," I said, my voice cold. "I'll pass every evaluation they throw at me. But I'm not answering their calls." And I didn't. My phone buzzed incessantly. 47 missed calls from my mother, 30 from Nathan, 12 from my father. Voicemails that ranged from fake concern, "We just want to get you help, sweetie," to venomous threats, "You're going to rot in a facility." I deleted them all without listening. I was ghosting my own abuse. 3 days later, the war moved from the courts to my doorstep. It started with a low rumble, a vibration that shook the coffee in my cup. It wasn't the ocean, it was mechanical, heavy diesel engines. "Marcus," I said. "I see it," he replied, his hand already on his radio. I walked to the security monitors. On the screen, a convoy was rolling down the causeway. My father's luxury SUV led the pack, followed by two massive yellow bulldozers and a crew of contractors in orange vests. They stopped at the iron gates. My father jumped out of his car. He was waving a piece of paper, probably a fake deed or a work order. He was shouting at the foreman, pointing at the gates, pointing at the mansion. "What are they doing?" I asked. "They aren't here to visit," Marcus said, his jaw tight. "They're here to breach." I pressed the intercom button. The audio crackled into the library. "Right to enter," Jeffrey was screaming at the foreman. "I am the executor. That girl inside is a squatter. She's mentally unstable. Break this gate down. We have a renovation schedule to keep." "Mr. Carter," the foreman sounded hesitant. "This is a historic gate. Without a court order." "I am the court order," Jeffrey roared. "I pay you. Do your job, or I'll bury your company. Tear it down. We're gutting the place anyway." Gutting it. They weren't just going to evict me. They were going to destroy the Citadel. They were going to strip it for parts, sell the land, and erase every trace of William's legacy. My mother stepped out of the car, shielding her eyes from the sun, looking annoyed that the destruction wasn't happening faster. Nathan was filming it on his phone, probably for some renovation vlog to hype up his crypto scam. "Marcus," I said, "are the gates secure?" "They're reinforced steel," Marcus said, "but a bulldozer will breach them eventually." On the screen, the first bulldozer revved its engine. Black smoke poured into the sky. The foreman signaled the driver. The massive blade lifted. They were actually going to do it. They were going to ram the gate. My father looked at the camera lens, his eyes wild, his smile terrified and triumphant. "Open up, Brianna," his voice distorted over the speaker. "Or, we're coming in." I looked at Mr. Anthony. He wasn't panicking. He was checking his watch. "It's time," he said. I looked at the screen. The bulldozer inched forward. Metal groaned against metal. "Open the gate," I said. Marcus looked at me. "Miss Brianna." "Open it," I repeated. "Let them in." Because they thought they were breaking into a house. They didn't realize they were walking into a cage. The heavy iron gates groaned as the motors engaged. Slowly, agonizingly, they swung inward. The noise of the bulldozers dropped to an idle rumble. My father didn't wait. He marched through the opening, stepping onto the gravel with the swagger of a conquering general entering a surrendered city. My mother followed, adjusting her sunglasses already, looking at the facade as if measuring it for drapes. Nathan was right behind them, phone raised, live streaming his own victory lap. They expected to find me crying on the steps. They expected surrender. Instead, they found a tribunal. From the top of the stone stairs, the view was clear. To my left was Mr. Anthony. To my right, Marcus. But it was the man standing next to Marcus who made my father stop dead in his tracks. He was wearing a pinstripe suit, his arms crossed, a gold pin on his lapel catching the light. Attorney General David Sterling. The convoy of contractors behind my father slowed to a halt. The foreman looked at the Attorney General, then at my father, and killed the engine of his bulldozer. The silence that fell over the courtyard was heavy, suffocating. "What is this?" Jeffrey shouted, though his voice cracked slightly. "Get out of my way. I am taking possession of this property." "No, you aren't," Mr. Anthony said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the gravel like a gavel strike. He held up a tablet. "You are currently being live-streamed to the State Police database, Jeffrey. And the 3,000 people watching Nathan's stream just watched you order the destruction of a historic landmark you do not own." Nathan lowered his phone, his face draining of color. "I own this company," Jeffrey roared, pointing back at the SUV. "I am the CEO of Carter Industries. I built this." "Actually," I said. My voice was calm. "Clinical. You don't—" Mr. Anthony stepped forward. He didn't hand my father a document. He simply read from the one in his hand. Clause 4, Section B of the William Carter Living Trust. Upon his death, the controlling interest of Carter Industries, 51% of all voting shares, does not pass to the board. It passes to the heir of the Cliffside estate. I took a step down the stairs. I looked my father in the eye. "I own 51% of your company, Dad. I am the majority shareholder. I am the board." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step. I watched the math happening behind his eyes. He wasn't just disinherited. He was subordinate. You can't," he stammered. "I can," I said. "And as the majority shareholder, I am terminating your employment as CEO for gross misconduct effective immediately. You are trespassing on company time, using company resources to commit a felony." "You can't fire me," he screamed. "I am Jeffrey Carter. I am." "You are nothing," I cut him off. This is what psychologists call the delusion of the empty wallet. I watched it happen in real time. My father had never actually developed a personality, a moral code, or a spine. He had simply constructed a shell made of money and status. He believed his authority came from his voice, but it only ever came from his checkbook. Now that the checkbook was gone, the man underneath evaporated. He tried to muster his old rage to command the police officers who were now stepping out of the shadows, but his voice had no weight. It was thin, pathetic. Without his net worth, he wasn't a titan of industry. He was just an angry old man shouting on a lawn he didn't own. "Officers," I said. "Remove them." The police moved in. They bypassed my father, who was now hyperventilating, and went straight for Nathan. "Hey, Nathan!" yelped as they grabbed his arms. "I didn't do anything." "Criminal damage to property," the officer said, cuffing him. "We have you on video, kicking the gate." My mother let out a shrill cry. She looked from her husband, who was slumped over the hood of his car, to her son in handcuffs, and then up at me. Her face shifted. The sneer vanished, replaced instantly by a desperate, fawning smile. It was the most terrifying transformation I had ever seen. "Brianna, baby," she pleaded, taking a step toward the stairs. "Please. This is a misunderstanding. We were just stressed. We're family. We love you." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had watched me be evicted and said nothing. "Get off my property," I said. I turned my back on them and walked into the house. Behind me, I heard the sound of handcuffs clicking and my father weeping. I didn't look back. The war was over. The police lights faded down the long driveway, leaving the courtyard in darkness. For a long time, I just stood there, breathing in the salt air. It didn't smell like fear anymore. It smelled like victory. The fallout was swift and brutal. When you build your entire identity on status, losing it is like dying. My father wasn't just fired, he was erased. The board of Carter Industries, seeing the footage of their CEO being arrested for trespassing and criminal damage, voted unanimously to remove him before the sun came up the next morning. I didn't even have to cast my controlling vote. They did it for me. My mother found herself uninvited from every gala, every board, every social club in Newport. The friends she had cultivated for decades dropped her the moment the scandal broke. It turns out, social capital is just as liquid as cash, and she was bankrupt. Nathan pled guilty to the property damage charges to avoid jail time, but his reputation as a tech genius was shattered. They tried to reach out, of course. Letters from lawyers begging for a settlement. Long, rambling emails from my mother about forgiveness and starting over. I didn't read them. I didn't delete them either. I simply forwarded them to a folder labeled Closed Cases and went back to work. Because I had work to do. The cliffside citadel didn't remain a fortress. I turned it into a sanctuary. We used the $5 billion legacy trust to establish the William Carter School for Preservation and Arts. The ballroom where my family once held hollow parties is now filled with students learning to restore paintings, repair antique furniture, and bind books. I still spend my days in the library. But I'm not alone anymore. Mr. Anthony comes by on Tuesdays for chess. Marcus teaches self-defense classes to the students on the lawn. We have dinner together in the kitchen, not as staff and employer, but as people who chose each other. This is the family William wanted for me. Not one bound by blood and obligation, but one built on loyalty and respect. Yesterday, I finally opened the last envelope William left in the safe. It wasn't a legal document. It was a handwritten note, the ink slightly faded. "My dearest Brianna," it read. "I know you always wondered why I didn't intervene sooner, why I let you stay in that apartment scraping by. I needed you to see them clearly. I needed you to know without a shadow of a doubt that you could survive without them. You think you were the backup plan because you were quiet, but you were never the backup plan, Brianna. You were the only plan. The loud ones destroy, the quiet ones build. Build something beautiful." I folded the letter and placed it inside the cover of the first book I ever restored. I looked out the window at the ocean crashing against the cliffs that had protected us for generations. I wasn't just the keeper of the estate anymore. I was its architect. I sat at my workbench, picked up my bone folder and my glue, and went back to work. There were broken things in the world that needed fixing, and for the first time in my life, I had all the time in the world. Sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. If you've ever had to build your own peace, share this story. You never know who needs to hear that it's okay to walk away.